There is a moment buried somewhere deep in human prehistory where everything changed. A person, probably exhausted, probably desperate, picked up a piece of rock and started hitting it against another piece of rock. Not to build something, not to create art, to make an edge, a killing edge. And from that single, violent, almost accidental decision, a chain of events began that would stretch across 10,000 years of human history and end with one of the most iconic objects ever created, the sword. But here is the thing almost nobody tells you. The sword did not arrive suddenly. It was not invented. It evolved painfully, slowly, through failure after failure, through wars and empires and metallurgical accidents, until one day it simply existed. And once it did, the world was never the same again. To understand how we got there, we have to go back much further than most people expect. Not to medieval knights, not to Roman legions, not even to the Bronze Age. We have to go back to the Stone Age, to a time when the most dangerous weapon a human being could carry was nothing more than a carefully shaped piece of flint. These were called napped blades. Early humans discovered that certain types of stone, particularly flint, obsidian, and chert, had a peculiar property. When you struck them at the right angle with enough force, they would fracture in a predictable, controllable way. The result was a razor-sharp edge that could slice through animal hide, wood, and human flesh with surprising efficiency. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, could be worked into blades so sharp that modern surgeons have actually experimented with obsidian scalpels, finding them sharper than steel under a microscope. Let that sink in for a second. The Stone Age had cutting technology that, in some respects, we still have not fully surpassed. But stone has a fatal problem. It is brittle. It shatters. You cannot make it long without it breaking. The longest practical stone blades ancient people could produce were maybe 20 or 30 centimeters. And even those were fragile, precious objects. You could not charge into battle swinging a stone blade the way you could a sword. You needed something else. Something that combined sharpness with strength and flexibility. Something that could be made long. What humans needed, though they could not have known it yet, was metal. The first metal humans ever worked was not iron. It was not even bronze. It was copper, and the reason is almost embarrassingly simple. Pure copper sometimes occurs naturally at the surface of the earth. You can find lumps of it just sitting there, waiting to be picked up. Early humans, somewhere around 8 or 9,000 years ago in regions like Anatolia and the Middle East, started experimenting with these copper nuggets. They hammered them. They shaped them. They discovered that, unlike stone, copper would deform rather than shatter. It was malleable. You could beat it into new shapes repeatedly without it cracking. This was a revelation. The first copper tools were simple. Pins, hooks, small blades. The copper was cold-hammered, meaning nobody was melting it yet, just beating it into shape. But over time, humans made a second discovery, arguably one of the most important accidents in all of human history. When copper gets hot enough, it melts. And when it melts, it can be poured into a mold, and when it cools, it takes on whatever shape that mold had. Casting was born. Now humans could make objects of virtually any shape they could imagine. But copper alone was still not good enough. Pure copper is soft. A copper blade holds an edge poorly and bends under stress. Soldiers and hunters needed something harder. And then someone, somewhere, made a mistake that changed civilization. Nobody knows exactly who made this discovery, or where, or when, with total precision, but the current evidence points to somewhere in the Middle East, or possibly the Balkans, around 5,000 years ago. The discovery was this: if you mix copper with tin in roughly the right proportions, you get something completely different from either metal alone. You get bronze. Bronze is harder than copper. It holds a sharper edge, it is stronger under impact, it casts beautifully, and once people realized what they had, the world entered what we now call the Bronze Age. A period of history where bronze did not just change weapons, but changed everything: farming tools, architecture, trade, empire. And this is where the sword story truly begins. Because bronze was good enough. For the first time in human history, you could make a blade that was long enough, strong enough, and sharp enough to be used as a primary weapon rather than a tool that sometimes got used in fights. Early bronze daggers appeared first, short stabbing weapons that were essentially just longer versions of the copper blades that came before them. But then smiths started pushing the boundary. What happens if we make it longer? What if we make the blade long enough to reach an enemy before he can reach you? What if length itself becomes the weapon? The answer came in the form of the first true swords, and they appeared in a region that might surprise you. Not Egypt, not Greece, not Rome. The earliest confirmed swords, dated to around 3300 BCE, were found in Arslan Tepe in modern-day Turkey. These were bronze blades, long and slender, clearly designed not as tools but as dedicated fighting weapons. They were ceremonial in part, probably symbols of power and status, but they were also functional. They worked, and once the idea existed, it spread. By 1600 BCE, bronze swords were everywhere across the ancient world. Egypt had them. The Mycenaean Greeks had them. The peoples of the Indus Valley had them. Each culture developed slightly different designs based on how they fought and what resources they had access to. The Egyptians favored a curved blade called the khopesh, which looked almost like a sickle crossed with a sword. It was terrifying in close combat, designed for hooking around shields and pulling enemies off balance, slashing at necks and limbs in the press of a melee. The Mycenaean Greeks, on the other hand, developed long, rapier-like thrusting swords with blades that could reach nearly a meter in length. These were weapons built for individual combat between warriors, the kind of dueling culture that Homer would later immortalize in the Iliad, where heroes stepped out of the battle line to face each other one-on-one. But bronze swords had a serious limitation hiding underneath all their glory, and it would eventually doom them. Bronze requires tin. Tin does not occur everywhere. It had to be traded across enormous distances from mines in places like Cornwall in Britain or Afghanistan, carried along trade routes that stretched across continents. This made bronze expensive. It made it exclusive. Bronze swords were the weapons of elites, of kings and champions. The average soldier was still fighting with spears and bows, cheaper weapons that required less material and less skill to produce. The sword was magnificent, but it was still a luxury. It was still out of reach for most people. And then the world fell apart. Around 1200 BCE, something catastrophic happened across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the most debated mysteries in all of ancient history. Within the space of a few decades, almost every major civilization in the region collapsed simultaneously. The Mycenaean Greeks vanished. The Hittite Empire disintegrated. Egypt survived, but was shattered. Trade networks that had functioned for centuries simply stopped. And with the trade networks gone, the supply of tin evaporated. Bronze became nearly impossible to produce. An entire technological foundation of civilization crumbled almost overnight. Into this vacuum came iron. And iron, it turns out, was about to change everything in a way that nobody in the Bronze Age could have predicted. Because here is the twist. Iron was not new. Humans had known about iron for a long time before the Bronze Age collapse. Meteoric iron, iron that fell from the sky in meteorites, had been worked and prized for thousands of years before anyone knew how to smelt it from ore. The Egyptians called it metal of heaven. Tutankhamun was buried with a dagger made from meteoric iron that was more valuable than gold at the time. But meteoric iron is vanishingly rare. You cannot build an army out of fallen stars. The trick was learning to smelt iron from ordinary iron ore, which is abundant almost everywhere on Earth. And this is where the process became brutally complicated. Iron melts at a much higher temperature than copper or bronze, around 1,538 degrees Celsius, versus roughly 950 degrees for bronze. The furnaces of the Bronze Age simply could not get hot enough to melt iron properly. But ancient smiths discovered, through what must have been an enormously frustrating process of trial and error, that you did not necessarily need to melt iron completely. If you heated iron ore in a charcoal furnace to the right temperature and then hammered it repeatedly while it was still hot, you could work out the impurities and consolidate the metal into a usable form. This process was called bloomery smelting, and the spongy lump of iron it produced was called a bloom. It was slow, it was labor-intensive, it required enormous skill and patience. But it worked. Early iron was actually inferior to good bronze in many respects. It was softer, it rusted, and it was harder to work consistently. A poorly made iron sword was genuinely worse than a well-made bronze one. So why did iron win? The answer is brutally simple. Iron ore is everywhere. Almost every region on Earth has accessible iron deposits. Once you knew the technique, you did not need long-distance trade routes. You did not need to import tin from the other side of the continent. A village with a decent furnace and a skilled smith could make iron weapons from local materials. Iron democratized the sword. For the first time in history, ordinary soldiers could carry blades. Armies could be equipped with swords en masse. The exclusive weapon of kings became the common weapon of warriors. And then smiths made the discovery that turned iron from a compromise into a revolution. By controlling the amount of carbon that iron absorbed during the smelting process, you could produce a material that was not just iron anymore. You could produce steel. Steel, which is essentially iron with a carefully managed carbon content, is harder than bronze, holds a sharper edge, is far more flexible, and can be repeatedly heated and worked into forms of extraordinary precision. The first true steel blades appeared around 1000 BCE, and from that point forward, the trajectory of the sword changed completely. The Romans understood this better than almost anyone before them. The Roman legionary carried a sword called the gladius, a short, broad, wickedly sharp weapon optimized for the brutal close-quarters fighting that Roman infantry tactics demanded. The gladius was not elegant. It was not beautiful in the way that later swords would be. It was a tool of industrialized violence, designed to be thrust upward into an enemy's abdomen in the crush of a shield wall. Roman soldiers trained obsessively with it, and Roman commanders understood something that many of their enemies did not. A short sword used by a disciplined soldier in tight formation beats a long sword used by an individual warrior almost every single time. The gladius helped build an empire, but empires fall, and as Rome declined, the nature of warfare shifted, and the sword shifted with it. Cavalry became more important. Fighting on horseback required a longer blade, something you could swing down at infantry without falling off your horse. The spatha, a longer Roman cavalry sword, gradually replaced the gladius, and it became the ancestor of the swords that would define the next great era of sword history, the early medieval period. The age of the Viking sword, the knightly sword, the weapon that most people picture when they close their eyes and think of the word sword. The Viking sword was a masterpiece of early medieval metallurgy. The best examples were made using a technique called pattern welding, where smiths twisted and folded together rods of iron and steel with different carbon contents, then welded them into a single blade. The result was not just structurally superior, combining a hard-cutting edge with a more flexible core, it was visually spectacular. The twisted internal patterns caught the light and rippled along the blade like flowing water. Vikings named their swords. They passed them down through generations. A great sword was not just a weapon, it was an heirloom, a piece of the family's identity, almost a living thing. And then came the final transformation, the one that produced the sword in its most recognizable, most perfected form. As armor improved through the medieval period, swords had to change in response. When enemies started wearing mail and then plate armor, a simple slashing blade became less effective. Smiths lengthened the blade, narrowed the point, stiffened the cross-section to allow powerful thrusting attacks that could find gaps in plate armor. The cruciform hilt, with its distinctive crossguard, became standard, protecting the hand and allowing complex techniques. Grips were lengthened to allow two-handed use for greater power. The sword became a sophisticated instrument requiring years of dedicated training to use properly. By the late medieval and Renaissance periods, European swordsmanship had evolved into a complex martial art with entire schools of technique, complete with manuals, masters, and traditions that rivaled any discipline of the ancient world. The sword was no longer just a weapon, it was a system. It represented a philosophy of movement, of geometry, of timing and control, and it represented something else too, something that goes far beyond the battlefield. The sword had become a symbol. In almost every culture that produced them, swords accumulated meaning far beyond their function as killing tools. In Japan, the katana was considered to hold the soul of the samurai who carried it. The forging of a Japanese blade was a ritual act as much as a technical one, with master swordsmiths purifying themselves before working, treating the creation of a sword as a spiritual undertaking. The geometry of the katana, that gentle curve, the differential hardening that created a razor edge on one side and a resilient spine on the other, was the product of centuries of accumulated knowledge pushed to a point of near perfection. In Europe, swords were blessed by priests, engraved with prayers and the names of saints, buried with their owners as companions into the afterlife. Kings received swords as symbols of their authority. Knights were touched on the shoulder with a blade at the moment they entered a new order of society. The sword divided the noble from the common, the warrior from the farmer, the ruler from the ruled. You did not just carry a sword, you became someone different when you carried one. And then gunpowder arrived, and the story that had begun with a desperate human hitting one rock against another in the prehistoric dark began, slowly, to close. Firearms made mass formations of trained swordsmen obsolete on the open battlefield. The centuries of accumulated technique, the schools, the masters, the manuals, the lifetime dedications, all of it became increasingly irrelevant against an enemy who could kill you from 100 meters away with minimal training. The sword retreated from the battlefield and became a sidearm, then a ceremonial object, then a sport, then a symbol, with no practical military function at all. But here is what makes the whole story remarkable. The sword never disappeared. It survived the end of its own usefulness. Armies still carry ceremonial swords. Officers are still commissioned with them. Courts still use them in rituals. Martial artists still dedicate years to mastering their use. We still make them, still collect them, still study them. Because somewhere in the human relationship with the sword, something got encoded that goes deeper than tactics or technology. The sword is the clearest line we can draw between the person who picked up that first piece of flint and the civilization that eventually put a man on the moon. It is the object that most completely traces the arc of human ingenuity, from the first desperate edge to the perfected blade, from survival to empire, to art to symbol. 10,000 years of human ambition, hammered into steel.